The wind across the dry mesa did not howl. It shrieked, carrying sharp, biting red dust that slowly turned into a freezing, blinding sleet as the temperature plummeted. At the Hollow Rock stage station, the heavy wooden sign swinging above the porch groaned on its rusted iron hinges, a steady, rhythmic warning that the frontier was closing its jaws. Inside the dim, drafty station, Sarah O'Connor stood perfectly still beside the cracked front window. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the cold, heavy wood of her double-barreled shotgun. She wore a faded black morning dress, completely obscured by a thick, dust-stained canvas apron. It had been 8 months since the stagecoach raid that left her husband dead and the station abandoned by the company. 8 months of jumping at shadows. 8 months of keeping the heavy iron bolts thrown across the timber door. The freezing sleet battered the glass. Through the cracked pane, the world outside was a swirling vortex of grey and white. But then, a shadow separated itself from the storm. Sarah raised the shotgun, her thumb resting on the cold metal hammer. A man staggered onto the porch. He was tall, his broad shoulders hunched forward against the wind. He wore a weathered buckskin jacket, dark with freezing rain, and moccasin boots that made no sound against the wooden floorboards. His long, jet-black hair was plastered to his neck, and his skin was a warm bronze, heavily weathered by the harsh elements. A half-Apache tracker. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Men like him did not come to isolated stations unless they were hunting or being hunted. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he collapsed against the heavy wooden door, his knees hitting the porch with a dull thud. Sarah didn't move. The frontier had taught her that mercy was often a trap. She tightened her grip on the gun, waiting for him to push himself up, waiting for the rest of a gang to appear from the tree line. But no one else came. The man just stayed there, leaning against the timber, his body shivering violently. Then, a sound cut through the shrieking wind. It was thin, weak, desperate. A baby's cry. Sarah lowered the shotgun a fraction of an inch. She leaned closer to the cracked glass. The man shifted his weight, turning slightly to shield his chest from the biting wind. Strapped tightly to his front, wrapped inside a massive, heavy coat, was a traditional woven Apache cradle, oared. The woven hood was pulled down to block the sleet, but the tiny, fragile wail coming from inside it was unmistakable. He raised one hand, his knuckles split and dark with dried blood, and knocked once, weakly, against the door. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked back at the small iron stove in the centre of the room, radiating a meagre, steady heat. On the table nearby sat a cracked porcelain teacup, meticulously clean, resting in the exact spot her husband used to sit. The silence of the empty station felt suffocating. If she opened that door, she was letting the violence of the frontier inside. If she didn't, a child would freeze to death on her porch before sunset. The baby cried again, a broken, rattling sound of pure exhaustion. Sarah didn't think anymore. She rested the shotgun against the doorframe, her hands trembling as she grabbed the heavy iron bolt and slid it back. The door flew open, caught by a violent gust of wind. Sleet and red dust swept into the room, biting at Sarah's face. The man looked up.
Hello?
His deep-set, dark brown eyes were glazed with exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, there was a coiled, fierce vigilance. He didn't look at her like a victim seeking a savior. He looked at her like a cornered wolf, calculating if she was a threat to the cub. Around his neck, stark against his dark skin, was a flat, faded ring of scar tissue. A rope burn. "Please," he rasped. His voice, he was a low, gravelly rumble, completely stripped of pride, but heavily guarded. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't ask for a fire. He carefully unfastened his frozen jacket, revealing the cradle board and a tiny face wrapped in a faded blue woolen blanket. "My baby needs milk." Sarah stared at him. The man was half dead. He had blood on his hands, a hangman's scar on his neck, and the aura of a man who had been running for a very long time. The town of Red Creek, 50 miles east, had been hunting a half-breed outlaw for a week. The stagecoach driver who had passed by 2 days ago mentioned a massive bounty for a man who looked exactly like the one bleeding on her porch. "Who is following you?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though her hands gripped her dusty apron tightly.
"You're late."
"Dead men if they catch up," he answered flatly. He swayed slightly, his eyelids heavy. "I don't need your fire, ma'am. I just need a cup of milk. Then we'll ride on." He tried to push himself up, to turn back toward the freezing whiteout, but his legs failed him. He slumped hard against the doorframe, his arm instinctively wrapping completely around the cradleboard to cushion the impact. He took the brunt of the fall on his own bruised shoulder, letting out a sharp grunt of pain. The baby began to wail louder, a sound of absolute, hollow hunger. Sarah looked at the vast, deadly white void behind him. It was 20 degrees below freezing. There was nowhere to ride. There was only death out there.
Yeah.
She looked down at the man, at the way his bloody hands hovered over the cradleboard, touching nothing, just forming a protective cage. He was a dangerous man. The town probably wanted him to hang. But a man who used his own body to break a fall for a child was not a monster. Sarah stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Get inside," she commanded, her voice cutting through the wind. He hesitated, his dark eyes searching her face, assessing the risk.
"Get inside before that child freezes," Sarah repeated, this time.
She reached down, grabbing the thick leather collar of his buckskin jacket, and hauled him forward. Kalen Rower crawled over the threshold, his body shuddering as the meagre warmth of the room hit him. Sarah slammed the heavy timber door shut, throwing the iron bolt back into place with a loud, final clack. The howling of the storm was instantly muffled. For the first time in 8 months, Sarah O'Connor was no longer alone in the Hollow Rock stage station. And as she looked at the wanted man bleeding on her floorboards, she knew the real storm was just beginning. The heavy iron bolt slid into place with a sound like a gunshot, sealing the Hollow Rock stage station against the shrieking sleet. Inside, the sudden absence of the wind's roar left a ringing silence in the drafty room, broken only by the crackle of the small iron stove and the ragged, exhausted cries of the infant. Kalen Rower did not move toward the fire. Despite the violent shivers racking his large frame, he deliberately sank to the floorboards right where he stood, pressing his back against the heavy timber of the front door. It was the posture of a man who fully expected the door to be kicked in at any moment. By sitting there, he made his own body the final barricade between the storm and whatever hunted him and the rest of the room. Sarah watched him, her hand still resting on the stock of her shotgun, leaning against the wall. "There is a chair by the hearth," she said, her voice tight, trying to maintain authority in a room that suddenly felt much smaller. "I'm fine here, ma'am," Cale replied, the gravel in his voice scraping against the quiet. He didn't look at her. His absolute focus was on the woven Apache cradleboard strapped to his chest. His thick, blood-crusted fingers moved with startling precision, unfastening the frozen leather ties of his buckskin jacket. When he pulled the heavy blue blanket back, Sarah caught her breath. The baby was incredibly small, perhaps no more than a few months old, with a shock of dark hair and cheeks flushed an angry, unnatural red from the biting cold. The infant's cries were growing weaker, a terrifying sign that the cold and hunger were winning. Sarah let go of the shotgun. Some instincts were older than ear. She moved quickly to the small pantry built into the back wall, her dusty canvas apron brushing against the floorboards. She retrieved a sealed jar of goat's milk she kept in the cool dark and poured a small amount into a battered tin cup. She set the cup on the flat iron top of the stove to warm, her hands shaking slightly. As she worked, she stole glances at the man guarding her door. The lantern light flickered across his face, highlighting the harsh, flat planes of his cheekbones and the aquiline hook of his nose. But it was the rope burn on his neck that drew her eyes. It was a vicious, angry ring of raw, chafed skin, fading into a bruised purple. It wasn't an old battle scar. It was fresh. A town mob or a bounty posse had put a noose around his neck, and somehow he had broken free. He was a dead man walking, and by locking him inside, she had just made herself his accomplice. "It's warming," Sarah said quietly, pulling a clean white rag from her apron pocket to serve as a makeshift teat. Cale nodded once. He carefully unlaced the front of the cradle board, lifting the tiny infant out of the woven basket. The baby fit entirely in the span of his forearms. He held the child against his chest, tucking the faded blue blankets securely around the small, trembling shoulders, trying to share whatever meager body heat he had left. Sarah wrapped a cloth around the hot tin cup and walked slowly toward him. She said, topped exactly 2 feet away, the unspoken boundary between them practically humming with tension. She knelt on the floorboards and extended the cup. Cale reached out. For a moment, his hand hovered over hers. His knuckles were split and caked with dried blood, the skin weathered and rough as old saddle leather. His fingernails were bruised dark. They were hands built for violence, capable of breaking a man's jaw or pulling a trigger without hesitation. Yet, as he took the tin cup from her, his touch was impossibly light. He didn't graze her fingers. He took the cup with a reverence that made Sarah's throat tighten. "Thank you," he murmured, his dark eyes meeting her amber ones for a fraction of a second. There was no threat in his gaze, only a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. Sarah stood back, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. She watched as Cale dipped the corner of the clean rag into the warm milk and brought it to the baby's lips. The infant latched on immediately, whimpering as the warm liquid finally arrived. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the Hollow Rock stage station was the soft, rhythmic swallowing of the child and the howling wind rattling the window panes. Cale's massive, lethal frame was hunched over the tiny bundle, completely absorbed in the act of keeping the baby alive. He dipped the rag, offered it, wiped a drop of milk from the baby's chin, and repeated the motion with endless, quiet patience. He didn't take a single drop for himself. He didn't move closer to the fire. Sarah found herself staring. The men who had come through this station over the years were hard, loud, and careless. Even the lawmen treated vulnerability as a weakness. But the half-Apache tracker sitting by her door possessed a quiet, grounded mercy that completely contradicted the brutal scar around his neck. As the baby finally drank its fill and let out a soft, contented sigh, Cale shifted his weight against the heavy timber door. He reached inside the inner pocket of his wet buckskin jacket, perhaps looking for a dry cloth. As he pulled his hand out, something caught on the lining. A small, heavy object slipped from his grasp. It hit the wooden floorboards with a sharp, metallic clink and rolled across the uneven planks, coming to a dead stop just inches from the toe of Sarah's boot. Sarah looked down. It was a heavy, silver dollar. But it wasn't a normal coin.
The firelight caught the distinct, deep gouge slashed across the face of Lady Liberty, a violent, jagged scratch made by a misfired bullet. The air in the room instantly froze. Sarah's breath completely stopped. Her eyes widened, locking onto the silver coin as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She knew that coin. 8 months ago, a heavy lockbox had been stolen from the stagecoach outside this very station. Inside that lockbox was a pouch of silver dollars her husband had been guarding. Anne, and she vividly remembered her husband, laughing by the fire a week before he died, showing her that exact ruined coin, keeping it as a lucky charm. The men who killed her husband had taken it. A sickening wave of dread washed over her. Her eyes slowly trailed up from the floor, moving past Cale's bloodied hands, past the sleeping baby, until she met his dark, hyper-observant eyes. Cale had frozen perfectly still. He saw her recognize it. He saw the exact moment the tentative, fragile peace between them shattered. With a movement so fast it was a blur, Cale's large hand shot out, snatching the coin from the floorboards and slipping it back into his pocket. He didn't offer a single word of explanation. He simply pulled the baby tighter against his chest and went completely rigid, his muscles coiled tight, waiting for her to move toward the shotgun. The wind outside shrieked, rattling the cracked window panes. Sarah took a slow, deliberate step backward, her hand blindly reaching toward the wall where her weapon rested. She had opened her door to save a starving baby, but the man holding it might be the very reason she was a widow. Sarah's heel struck the rough timber of the back wall. The cold, polished steel of the shotgun barrels was only inches from her trembling fingers. She didn't blink, her amber eyes locked on the half-Apache tracker sitting against her door. Kalen Rower did not lunge to stop her. He did not draw a weapon. He simply sat there, his massive shoulders rigid, his dark eyes watching her with a terrible, heavy stillness. His right hand remained inside his buckskin jacket, fingers curled tightly around the ruined silver dollar. Against his palm, the cold metal seemed to burn. It carried the ghost of the Red Creek town square. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the blinding glare of the midday sun, the jeering faces of the mob, the suffocating smell of cheap whiskey and horse sweat. He remembered Red Gantry, the man he had once trusted to guide the canyon trails, leaning in close with a mock expression of sorrow. Gantry had pretended to help him up after a brutal beating from the sheriff's deputies, but instead he had slipped the stolen silver dollar deep into Cale's pocket just seconds before the search. "Half-breeds make the best scapegoats, Cale," Gantry had whispered, his breath hot against Cale's ear. Then came the harsh scratch of the hemp rope around his throat, the sudden terrifying weightlessness as the barrel was kicked out from under his boots. The world had turned blinding red, then black. If the rotting crossbeam of the hastily built gallows hadn't splintered and snapped under his sudden weight, he would be dead in the dirt. He had fought his way out of that square, with nothing but a stolen horse, a broken necktie of a scar, and his dead sister's baby. "You killed him," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking, breaking the heavy silence of the station. Her fingers brushed the stock of the shotgun. "That was my husband's coin. He kept it in his vest." "I didn't kill him," Cale replied. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, barely carrying over the howling wind outside. He made no sudden moves. He kept his left arm securely wrapped around the sleeping infant. "The man who put this rope burn on my neck killed your husband. He led the raid on this station. He planted the coin on me to hide his own tracks when the law got too close." Sarah stared at him, her chest heaving. "Why should I believe a wanted man?" "Because if I were a killer," Cale said softly, his dark, hyper-observant eyes never leaving hers. I wouldn't have knocked on your door to ask for milk. I would have kicked it off its hinges. Before Sarah could process the brutal logic of his words, the storm outside escalated with terrifying suddenness. A massive gust of wind, carrying chunks of solid ice, slammed against the broadside of the hollow rock stage station. The impact was deafening, a sharp, concussive crack that sounded exactly like the boom of a scattergun firing at close range. Sarah gasped, her knees buckling instantly. The shotgun slipped from her reach, clattering uselessly to the floor. She dropped to the wooden planks, her hands flying up to cover her ears, her eyes squeezing shut. The sound tore straight through her fragile defences, dragging her violently back to the night of the raid. The splintering wood, the shouting men, the heavy thud of her husband falling against the porch steps. She curled into herself, her dusty canvas apron tangling around her legs, her breathing reducing to panicked, ragged hitches. She was trapped in the memory, waiting for the door to burst open, waiting for the violence to end her. Then, a heavy, warm presence settled on the floorboards just a few feet away. Listen to my voice. A deep, steady rumble commanded. Sarah flinched, trying to press herself further into the corner, but the voice didn't push. It just anchored itself in the space between her and the door. Look at the floorboards, Sarah, Cale said. He had moved across the room silently, bringing the baby with him. Look at the dust. The timber is holding. There are no men outside. It's just the wind. She forced her eyes open a fraction. The first thing she saw was the scuffed leather of his moccasin boots. Then, his large, blood-crusted hand resting flat and open on the wooden floor, completely empty. He wasn't holding a gun. He wasn't looming over her. He was kneeling at her level, using his own steady breathing to set a rhythm for the panicked air in the room. It's just ice hitting the wood, Cale murmured, his tone stripped of the harsh edge it had carried before. It was the voice of a tracker calming a spooked, terrified animal. You're inside. You're safe. The bolt is still thrown. Sarah let out a long, shuddering exhale, her hands slowly lowering from her ears. The station came back into focus, the smell of wood smoke, the dim, flickering lantern light, the man kneeling before her, whose dark eyes held an unexpected, profound understanding of trauma. He knew what it looked like when the mind betrayed the body. He had seen it before. As the panic slowly ebbed from her veins, a new sound replaced it. A thin, reedy whimper. Cale looked down at his chest. The baby was shifting restlessly inside the faded blue blanket. Cale carefully touched the back of his rough knuckles to the infant's forehead, his jaw instantly tightening. "She's burning up," he said, the urgency bleeding back into his voice. "The extreme cold is retreating from her blood, and the fever is taking its place. The milk gave her strength to fight, but her body is too small." Sarah snapped fully back to the present. The instinct to care, the deeply buried maternal warmth she had locked away after her miscarriage, surged past her fear. She scrambled to her feet, wiping the residual tears from her face with the back of her dusty apron. The silver coin, the bounty hunters, the stagecoach raid, all of it faded behind the immediate, desperate need of the child. "Bring her to the stove," Sarah ordered, her voice losing its tremor. She grabbed a clean tin basin from the shelf and hurried to the water barrel in the corner, breaking the thin layer of ice on top with a wooden ladle. "We need to bring her temperature down slowly, or she'll go into shock." Cale stood, carrying the cradle board to the small wooden table nearest the iron stove. He carefully unlaced the bindings, freeing the baby entirely, and laid her on Sarah's clean wool shawl. The little girl was flushed an angry red, her breathing far too rapid, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow jerks.
Sarah brought the basin of icy water and a stack of clean, soft rags. For the next hour, they worked in absolute, focused silence. Sarah dipped the cloths, wringing them out until they were just damp, and gently pressed them to the baby's forehead, neck, and wrists. Cale stood beside her, his massive presence shielding them from the drafts leaking through the window frames. He didn't pace. He stood like a sentinel, his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his niece's chest. At one point, Sarah reached for a fresh rag, and her fingers accidentally brushed against Cale's wrist. His skin was freezing, his own coat still damp and cold, yet he hadn't asked for a blanket or a place near the fire. He was sacrificing every ounce of his own warmth and energy to ensure the child survived. Slowly, agonizingly, the harsh red flush began to fade from the baby's cheeks. Her frantic breathing smoothed out into a softer, deeper rhythm. The fever was breaking. Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She looked up at Cale. The harsh lines of his face had softened slightly with relief. Without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the scarred silver dollar, and placed it gently on the wooden table beside the cracked porcelain teacup. He didn't push it toward her. He simply left it there, in the open, a quiet surrender of his only proof, trusting her with the truth. But before Sarah could speak, Cale's head snapped up. His dark eyes widened slightly, locking onto the floorboards beneath his boots. The wind was still howling, rattling the heavy wooden sign outside. To Sarah, the storm sounded the same as it had all night. But Caelan Roa was a man who listened to the earth. "What is it?" Sarah whispered, the dread instantly returning to her throat. Cale slowly placed his hand flat against the timber wall, his jaw clenched tight. "Horses," he said grimly. "Heavy shod. 6 of them. They just crossed the ridge." He looked at the window, the sleet turning to heavy snow. "The bounty hunters didn't lose my trail. They just caught up." The hollow thud of hooves against frozen earth was still completely inaudible over the shrieking wind. But Caelan Roa did not need to hear them. He felt them. The subtle, rhythmic tremor traveled through the frozen ground, up the wooden pilings of the hollow rock stage station, and straight into the soles of his moccasins. Without a word, Cale moved away from the timber wall. His massive frame moved with a sudden, coiled urgency, his previous exhaustion buried beneath a terrifying instinct to protect. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and blew out the oil lantern. The station was instantly plunged into deep shadow, lit only by the low, flickering amber glow bleeding from the iron stove. "What are you doing?" Sarah whispered, the panic rising hot and fast in her throat. She instinctively reached out, her fingers grazing the back of the empty chair. 6 riders, heavy horses, Cale said, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He did not look at her. He moved straight to the small wooden table where the baby lay sleeping peacefully on Sarah's wool shawl. They crested the ridge. They'll be at the porch in less than 5 minutes. Sarah stared at him in the dim light. The wind battered the cracked window pane, piling snow against the glass. "How can you possibly know that? The storm." "A tracker knows when the earth is being beaten," Cale interrupted smoothly, his hands moving with mechanical, ruthless efficiency. He did not reach for the Apache cradleboard. Instead, he grabbed the edges of his wet, freezing buckskin jacket and began to lace it tightly across his chest. He pulled the collar high, hiding the vicious rope burn around his neck. He was sealing himself up. He was preparing for the cold. Sarah's breath hitched as she realized what he was doing. "You can't go out there. The fever just broke.
If you take her back into that sleet, I'm not taking her, Cale said softly. He stopped lacing his jacket and looked down at the tiny infant. The baby's chest rose and fell in a steady, even rhythm, completely oblivious to the violence riding down upon them. Cale's rough, blood-crusted hand hovered over the child's dark hair. For one agonizing second, the stoic, hardened mask of the tracker slipped. Sarah saw the devastating weight of a man looking at the only family he had left, knowing he would never see her grow up. He didn't touch the baby. He couldn't risk waking her. He slowly pulled his hand back and turned to face Sarah. Her name is Alara, Cale whispered. His deep-set eyes bored into Sarah's, stripping away the distance between them. He was no longer a wanted man talking to a station widow. He was a desperate uncle making his final plea. She doesn't cry much unless she's hungry. Keep her wrapped tight. When they ask, you tell them I forced my way in, drank your milk and left out the back. Cale, no. Sarah shook her head, taking a step forward. The dusty canvas apron rustled against her legs. They are a posse. They'll shoot you on sight. That is the point, Cale replied flatly. He turned toward the back door of the station, his boots silent against the floorboards. I will cut through the tree line heading north. I'll make sure they catch a glimpse of my tracks in the snow before the wind buries them. They want the bounty on my head. If they think I'm running for the canyon, they won't waste time tearing this station apart. The canyon is a dead end, Sarah argued, her voice rising over the storm. There is no shelter up there. It's 20 degrees below freezing. You are unarmed and exhausted. You won't last an hour in the open. Cale paused at the back door, resting his hand on the heavy iron latch. I only need to last long enough to pull them away from this room. Keep the bolt thrown, Sarah. He pressed the latch. The door cracked open, letting in a swirl of biting, blinding white snow. Wait! Sarah's voice was sharp. Crack. It's not your fight, ma'am, Cale warned, taking a step toward her. If they find me in here, they will burn this station to the ground with you inside it. Gantry doesn't leave witnesses. They took my husband's life. They took my peace. They took this coin, Sarah said, not looking back at him. She reached the front window and carefully peered through the cracked glass. It has always been my fight, Calen. I just didn't know who to shoot. Outside, the swirling snow briefly parted. Through the gloom, dark, massive shapes emerged from the tree line. Horses. 6 of them, heads low against the biting sleet, moving steadily toward the edge of the station's porch. Sarah felt her heart slam against her ribs, but her hands on the shotgun did not shake. She looked back over her shoulder at the half-Apache tracker. Take Alara into the pantry and stay out of sight, she ordered, her amber eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. I am not letting another innocent man die on my porch. Before Cale could argue, the sound of heavy boots hit the wooden planks outside. The heavy iron ring of the front door rattled violently. A fist pounded against the timber, echoing like thunder through the small room. Open up in there, a harsh, grating voice shouted over the wind. Open this door by order of the Red Creek Posse, or we're breaking it down. The pounding on the heavy timber door echoed again, vibrating through the floorboards and shaking the dust from the low rafters. I said open up in there! Sarah did not flinch. She glanced back toward the dark corner of the room. Calen Rower was standing near the pantry, his massive frame tense, his eyes burning with a mixture of awe and absolute terror for her safety. But he respected her command. He remained in the shadows, his body completely shielding the small wooden table where the infant slept safely out of sight. Sarah took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. She reached out and slid the heavy iron bolt back. She pulled the door open, but only a few inches, firmly planting her boot against the base of the heavy wood to prevent it from being kicked wide. The freezing sleet immediately lashed at her face, stinging her cheeks. On the porch stood 3 men, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Behind them, barely visible through the swirling whiteout, 3 more men sat mounted on exhausted, steaming horses. In the centre of the porch stood Red Gantry. Gantry was a large, heavy-set man with a thick, rust-coloured beard and a smile that never quite reached his pale, dead eyes. He wore a heavy wool coat with a silver deputy's star pinned haphazardly to his lapel, a badge bought with corrupt town money, not earned by courage. "Evening, Mrs. O'Connor," Gantry said, his voice loud and artificially polite over the howling wind. He tipped his snow-crusted hat, though his eyes were already busy scanning the narrow slice of the station's interior behind her. "Mighty terrible night to be out on the trail. We're tracking a fugitive, a half-breed killer. He murdered a man down in Red Creek and stole a horse. Tracks led this way before the snow covered him." "There is no one here but me," Sarah said, her voice steady. She raised the barrel of the shotgun just enough for the dim lantern light from inside to catch the cold steel. "And the station is closed." Gantry's fake smile faltered, his gaze dropping to the weapon. "Now, ma'am, there's no need for that. We're just a posse doing the town's good work. We need to come inside and have a look around. Make sure he ain't hiding under your floorboards." "No man with a drawn weapon enters my home," Sarah replied flatly, her grip tightening on the wooden stock. "You know the rules of this station." "Gantry." Gantry stepped closer, his heavy boot pressing aggressively against the threshold. The smell of cheap whiskey, wet horsehair and stale tobacco hit Sarah like a physical blow, turning her stomach. "Your husband ain't here to enforce those rules anymore, Sarah," Gantry said, dropping the polite act completely. His voice lowered to a menacing, guttural growl. "And I see fresh blood on the edge of these porch boards. Now, you're either harbouring a killer, which makes you an accomplice to the rope, or you're just a frightened widow who doesn't know any better. Step aside." He raised his gloved hand, moving to forcefully shove the heavy timber door wide open. Sarah's finger tensed on the trigger. She knew if she fired, she would undoubtedly kill Gantry. But the 5 men behind him would tear the station apart. She braced herself for the deafening roar of the gun. But before Gantry's hand could touch the wood, a massive silhouette emerged from the dim light of the station. Kalen Rower moved with the absolute silence of a shadow and the coiled speed of a striking snake. He stepped directly behind Sarah, his large, rough hand reaching over her shoulder. He didn't grab the gun violently. He gently but firmly gripped the double barrels of her shotgun, pressing the weapon downward, safely out of the line of fire. Sarah gasped, but Cale simply stepped past her, wedging his broad, muscular body into the narrow opening of the door. With one smooth, powerful motion, he pushed the heavy timber wide open, stepping fully out onto the freezing porch. The sudden appearance of the tall, dark-haired tracker caused the 2 men flanking Gantry to stumble backward in shock, frantically scrambling to pull their revolvers from their holsters. The horses in the yard whinnied, dancing nervously in the sleet. Cale stood perfectly still. He was completely unarmed, his buckskin jacket laced tight to his chin to hide the hangman's scar, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, a towering human shield blocking the doorway, placing himself entirely between the ruthless posse and the woman behind him. "Well, well, well," Gantry breathed, a cruel, triumphant grin splitting his bearded face. He slowly drew his own Colt revolver, levelling the long barrel directly at Cale's chest. Looks like the rat trapped himself. Cale did not look at the gun. His dark, hyper-observant eyes locked onto Gantry's face, showing no fear, only a cold, heavy resignation. "The widow has nothing to do with this," Cale said, his low, gravelly voice cutting through the shrieking wind with absolute, unshakable authority. "I forced the lock. I drank her milk. She was a hostage." Sarah stood in the doorway behind him, her heart breaking at the lie. He was deliberately throwing away his only defense, his only chance at proving his innocence, just to keep the posse's wrath focused entirely on him. He was a man accustomed to taking the world's brutality, so others wouldn't have to. "That's real noble of you, half-breed," Gantry sneered, cocking the hammer of his revolver with a loud metallic click. "But the town of Red Creek doesn't care much for your excuses. They just want you swinging from a stouter rope this time."
"You've caused me a lot of trouble, Rower. You should have just died in the square when I gave you the chance." "You planted the coin, Gantry," Cale stated smoothly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He just laid the truth bare in the freezing air. "You took the silver from the man you killed, and you needed a neck for the noose to close the sheriff's investigation." Gantry laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was quickly swallowed by the storm. "And who's going to believe you? A dead Apache against a deputized man. You're nothing out here. You're less than the red dirt on my boots. I'm going to put a bullet in your gut, let you bleed out in the snow, and then my boys and I are going to go inside and enjoy the widow's hospitality." At the explicit threat towards Sarah, Cale's entire demeanor shifted. The stoic stillness vanished, the muscles in his broad back bunched, and his hands curled into massive, lethal fists. He leaned forward slightly, completely ignoring the heavy revolver pointed at his heart. He was prepared to die, but the sheer, radiating violence rolling off his frame made it explicitly clear. He was going to take Gantry and the two men next to him straight to hell before he hit the ground. "Try to step over this threshold," Cale promised, his voice a deadly, vibrating rumble that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. "And see what happens." Gantry's grin widened into a snarl. His finger tightened on the trigger.
"Goodbye, Rower."
"Gantry!" The voice was female, but it rang out across the porch with the concussive force of a gunshot. Sarah O'Connor stepped out from the safety of the doorway, moving around Cale's massive arm. She didn't raise the shotgun. She let it hang in her left hand, pointing at the floorboards. Instead, she held her right hand out into the dim, flickering lantern light spilling from the station, her palm flat and open. Resting in the center of her hand was the heavy silver dollar, the deep, jagged bullet scar across Lady Liberty's face, catching the pale light of the storm. The heavy silver dollar rested perfectly flat on Sarah's trembling palm, the jagged, violent gouge across Lady Liberty's face, catching the pale, flickering light of the storm. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. Even the shrieking wind of the hollow rock mesa felt secondary to the sudden, suffocating silence that fell over the porch. "Red." Gantry stopped breathing. The cruel, triumphant sneer that had twisted his bearded face only seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chalky pallor. His eyes, previously locked on Cale's chest, darted down to the coin in the widow's hand. He recognized it instantly. Every man in the Red Creek posse knew that coin. It was the centerpiece of the evidence Gantry had loudly paraded in the town square that very morning, the proof he claimed he had pulled from the half-breed tracker's pockets to justify the hanging. "You told the town you found this on him," Sarah said, her voice piercing the freezing air with absolute, unshakable clarity. She didn't look at Gantry. She lifted her chin, her amber eyes locking directly onto the 5 posse members mounted behind him in the swirling snow.
You told them this man was the stagecoach robber. You told them he was the one holding the stolen silver. The men on horseback shifted uneasily. The leader of the riders, a weathered older man with a thick woolen scarf wrapped around his face, nudged his horse a step closer to the porch, his eyes narrowing at the coin. "That's the marked dollar, Mrs. O'Connor," the older rider called out over the wind, his voice heavy with sudden suspicion. "Deputy Gantry swore he pulled it off the tracker today. Proves the half-breed killed your husband 8 months back." "No, it doesn't," Sarah fired back, her voice ringing with a fierce, terrifying grief that she had kept locked away for nearly a year. "My husband kept this coin in his left breast pocket. The night he was murdered on this very porch, the killer took it. If this man," she gestured slightly toward Cale's massive, silent frame, "had killed my husband and stolen a lockbox full of silver, he wouldn't be starving on my doorstep 8 months later, begging for a cup of goat's milk for a freezing baby." She finally turned her gaze to Gantry. The false deputy was slowly backing up, his heavy boots crunching against the ice. "You kept it," Sarah whispered, the absolute disgust in her voice cutting deeper than a knife. "You kept my husband's lucky coin as a trophy. And when the real federal marshals started asking questions in Red Creek this week about the missing stagecoach money, you panicked. You needed a scapegoat. So you slipped it into the pocket of an outsider to hide your own bloody hands." "Shut your mouth, you crazy widow," Gantry roared, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. Realizing the posse behind him was no longer backing him up, Gantry made a desperate, lethal choice. He swung the long barrel of his Colt revolver away from Cale and aimed it directly at Sarah's chest. His finger jerked on the trigger. But Kalen Rower was already moving. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even shout. The half-Apache tracker lunged forward with a terrifying, explosive speed that defied his sheer size and exhaustion. Before Gantry's finger could fully depress the trigger, Cale's large, blood-crusted left hand clamped down brutally over the cylinder of the revolver, physically jamming the mechanism so the gun could not fire. Gantry let out a startled yell, trying to yank the weapon back, but Cale was a mountain of solid muscle, fueled by the desperate instinct to protect. With his right hand, Cale grabbed Gantry by the heavy wool collar of his coat, lifted the heavier man entirely off his boots, and slammed him backward into one of the thick timber support posts of the porch. The impact cracked the wood. Gantry gasped, the air completely driven from his lungs. The revolver slipped uselessly from his numb fingers, clattering onto the icy floorboards. Cale pressed his forearm against Gantry's throat, pinning the corrupt deputy to the post. The sheer, radiating violence in Cale's dark eyes was apocalyptic. He had every right to kill the man. Gantry had put a noose around his neck. Gantry had hunted him and his infant niece through a deadly blizzard. Gantry had just tried to murder the woman who gave them shelter. Cale's right fist pulled back, his knuckles hard as stone, ready to cave the man's skull in. "Cale, no!" Sarah's voice was not a scream. It was a firm, steady command. Cale froze. His massive chest heaved, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The lethal tension in his body vibrated like a plucked wire, but he did not strike. He hid. Gantry pinned against the timber, his dark eyes slowly shifting from the terrified, choking man back to Sarah. She stood in the doorway, lowering her hand, the silver coin safely closed in her fist. "He isn't worth the blood on your hands," she said quietly. "You are not the killer he tried to make you." Slowly, agonizingly, Cale lowered his fist. The restraint it took to pull back from the edge of violence was immense, but he obeyed her. He stepped back, letting Gantry slide down the wooden post, coughing and clutching his bruised throat. The sound of several rifle levers engaging echoed from the yard. Cale instinctively moved back to stand in front of Sarah, shielding her once again. But the posse was not aiming at him. All 5 riders had their rifles leveled squarely at Red Gantry, who was groveling in the snow on the edge of the porch. "I reckon the widow makes a lot of sense, Gantry," the older rider said, spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "You've been spending an awful lot of silver at the saloon these past few months, and you were awful eager to hang this tracker without a proper trial." "You fools," Gantry wheezed, trying to crawl backward. "He's an Apache. You're going to take the word of a half-breed and a hysterical woman over the law?" "You ain't the law, Red," the rider replied coldly. He motioned to 2 of the younger men. "Tie him to his saddle. The federal marshals are due in Red Creek by Tuesday. They can sort out the stagecoach money and the murder charge." The 2 men dismounted, their expressions grim. They hauled Gantry roughly to his feet, ignoring his curses, and bound his hands tightly with thick leather straps. The older rider looked past the struggling Gantry, his eyes settling on Cale. He tipped his snow-crusted hat in a gesture of reluctant, genuine respect. "You have my apologies, Tracker. That's a bad scar on your neck. You want to ride back with us? Press formal charges?" "No," Cale said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I just want you off this property." The rider nodded slowly. He looked at Sarah, offering another tip of his hat. "We'll take the old livery barn out back for the night, Mrs. O'Connor, if it's all the same to you. The storm's too thick to ride back now. But we won't bother your station. You have my word." Sarah gripped the doorframe, her posture stiff but dignified. "Keep the barn doors shut. There's dry wood in the back corner." "Much obliged, ma'am." The posse dragged Gantry through the accumulating snow, the corrupt deputy's curses fading as they disappeared into the swirling whiteout toward the outbuildings. Silence descended on the porch, save for the howling wind. Cale stood near the edge of the wooden steps, watching the darkness until he was absolutely certain they were gone. His broad shoulders slowly lowered. The coiled, lethal tension bled out of his muscles, leaving only a bone-deep, staggering exhaustion in its wake. He turned around, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's. He didn't have to speak. The look of profound, overwhelming gratitude in his gaze said more than 1,000 words ever could. She hadn't just saved his life. She had restored his humanity in a world that had tried to strip it away. Sarah stepped back, pulling the heavy timber door open wider.
"It's all right.
"Come inside, Cale," she said softly, the harshness completely gone from her voice. "The fire is waiting." The white-out blizzard broke just before dawn. The shrieking wind that had battered the Hollow Rock stage station for 3 relentless days finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. Sunlight pierced the retreating grey clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the endless drifts of snow that now buried the red dust of the mesa. Inside the station, the small iron stove radiated a steady, comforting heat. Sarah stood near the hearth, gently swaying back and forth. In her arms, wrapped securely in the faded blue blanket, little Alara was awake. The angry red flush of the fever was completely gone, replaced by the soft, healthy colour of a well-fed infant. The baby cooed softly, her tiny hands reaching up to grasp a loose thread on Sarah's dusty canvas apron. For the first time since her miscarriage, Sarah did not flinch from the touch of a child. She leaned her head down, resting her cheek against the baby's dark hair, closing her eyes as a profound, healing warmth spread through her chest. The suffocating silence of the empty station was gone. It had been replaced by the soft sounds of breathing, the crackle of dry firewood, and the rhythmic, steady thwack of an axe outside. Sarah opened her eyes and looked through the cracked window pane. Caelan Rower was in the yard. He had been out there since first light, moving with the tireless, grounded energy of a man who finally had something to build instead of something to flee. His heavy buckskin jacket was unlaced at the throat, the fading purple rope burn exposed to the cold morning air, no longer hidden, no longer a mark of shame. He was splitting firewood, his massive shoulders rising and falling in a smooth, powerful rhythm. Every swing of the axe was precise, splitting the frozen logs perfectly. He wasn't chopping wood just for the morning. He was chopping enough for a month. He was chopping wood like a man preparing to stay. A short while later, the heavy timber door opened. Cale stepped inside, bringing a rush of crisp, cold air with him. He carried an armful of split logs, kicking the door shut with the heel of his moccasin boot. He moved quietly to the stove, stacking the wood with careful precision before turning to look at Sarah and the baby. His dark, hyper-observant eyes softened. He reached up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his rough, scarred hand. "Fev hasn't returned," Cale observed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate perfectly with the warmth of the room. "She drank a full cup of milk an hour ago," Sarah replied softly. She stepped closer to the table. "She has a strong spirit, like her uncle." Cale looked down at his boots. He wasn't a man accustomed to praise. He was a man accustomed to being hunted, feared, or entirely ignored. He reached into his pocket and slowly withdrew his hand, placing something on the wooden table. It was the ruined silver dollar. Sarah looked at it, then up at him. The posse rode out at first light. The older rider left a note on the barn door. "They're taking gantry straight to the federal marshals in Red Creek. You're a free man, Caelan. The bounty is gone."
This isn't possible.
"I know," Cale said quietly. "I watched them ride out." He didn't make a move to pack his gear. He didn't reach for the Apache cradle board resting near the fire. He just stood there, his large frame occupying the space with a solid, undeniable permanence.
Look closer.
"You proved your innocence," Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. She reached out and touched the scarred silver coin. "You could go anywhere now. The whole frontier is open to you." Cale took a slow step forward. He looked around the small, drafty station. He saw the cracked window panes he intended to replace. He saw the heavy timber door he had defended. He saw the woman who had stood between him and a loaded gun, holding nothing but the truth in her bare hand. Finally, and his dark eyes settled on Sarah. "I've been running across the whole frontier my entire life, Sarah," he said, the raw honesty in his voice stripping away the last of his guarded walls. "I've slept in canyons, in the snow, with my back to the wind and one hand on a rifle. I know how to survive. But survival isn't a life." He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently brushing the edge of the blue blanket where Alara slept against Sarah's chest. He didn't pull away. "I knocked on your door because I needed milk for the child," Cale whispered. "But if you don't bolt that door behind me, I would like to stay and fix the roof." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the broken warrior who had offered his own life for hers without a second thought. She had spent 8 months guarding a tomb, terrified of the world outside. But the world had brought her this. It had brought her a man whose hands were built for violence, yet used entirely for protection. Sarah reached across the table. Her fingers brushed past the scarred silver dollar, and instead, she picked up the cracked porcelain teacup that had sat empty for 8 months. She walked over to the wash basin, rinsed it out, and poured a fresh measure of hot coffee from the stovepot. She turned back and offered the warm cup to Cale. "The roof needs patching," Sarah said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face, lighting up her amber eyes. "And the woodbox needs filling before nightfall." Cale accepted the cup, his large, rough fingers wrapping around the delicate porcelain. He took a sip, the warmth settling deep into his chest, uncoiling the last knot of tension he had carried since the gallows. Outside, the red dust of the hollow rock mesa was buried under a blanket of pure, quiet white. The brutal frontier had thrown everything it had at them, its storms, its cruelty, its corrupt men. But inside the station, the fire burned steady and bright. They had not just survived the winter, they had finally found a place worth keeping. If you've ever felt the profound relief of finding a single safe harbour in a world that can be so incredibly harsh, you understand Sarah and Cale's journey. Sometimes, the truest form of love doesn't come with pretty words or grand speeches. It comes from a silent protector who refuses to walk away, a warm fire when you are freezing, and the quiet courage to open your door one last time.
Here, drink this.
If this story of survival, mercy, and a family found in the untamed wilderness touched your heart, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more emotional frontier rescues.
Here, drink this.
Thank you. I needed this.